And how old are your kids?
The twins are 11, and my oldest guy's 13. He's at lacrosse right now. So yeah, they're pretty busy at this age, man. Like it just switches. You
Yeah,
go from wiping their asses every day and feeding them to like just driving them everywhere.
yeah, man. I mean, I've got a little man now, and we've got a second one on the way. And
Congrats, man.
I kind of can't. Thanks, man. I can't wait till they get to that age where I can just take them to sport and do all the good stuff.
Yeah, I've tagged you in some of my younger guys wrestling. He's right into wrestling. So when he
Oh, no
does that,
way.
you remember the few times I've
Ha-
tagged you?
yeah, yeah, that's awesome,
Yeah,
man.
yeah, he
How
loves it.
long has he been doing that?
He just started this year. They have a really good program here, but really took well to it. He just like really pays attention and listens, and he just executes the skills. He's like
Yeah,
a little
right.
robot. Yeah, he loves it.
That's awesome, man. It's pretty big wrestling in like the States and Canada and stuff. It's very small here in Australia. It's not like Olympic lifting, it's very like any real Olympic sport, it's not really funded here in Australia, so we don't get that big exposure like you guys do in the States.
Right.
But working with wrestlers at the moment now, they are some freak athletes, as you would know
Yeah,
from
and
what
you
you've
can
seen.
see. I mean, you must see now, like with your background in wrestling, just like the growth of BJJ just opens up so many opportunities now as like someone with a wrestling background to teach grappling because that's like it's huge now. Everyone grapples. Everyone is into that, and now everyone's like trying to figure out how to like learn some of these fundamental wrestling skills to bring to the mats.
Definitely. And the biggest limitations are when people like myself who are poor movers take up a combat sport at a later age,
Yeah,
and we start to realize that shit, I can't actually get into that position to be able to be safe and produce force. How do I get more enjoyment out of the sport? So that's pretty much why I delved into working with you and going through some mobility and really not only from a sport perspective, but improving my quality of life, being able
yeah,
to, get out of bed with a bit of a spring in your step and not feeling so, you know, compressed the whole time and exploring, different ways of, building strength, not only underneath a barbell, but, strengthening through even just body weight at end range
yeah.
is quite taxing. So credit to you. Anyone who's listening to this is the godfather of mobility. So it's been life changing. So I'm
Nah,
very
it's good
happy
to
to
hear.
have you on today. I've got a few questions. I hope I haven't caught you off guard, but I've
No,
just put together a few questions, and we've been working together now for quite some time, and we don't I haven't really had a chance to find out a bit more about your background, and I think people will be quite interested in this and interested in, like, when you were growing up, what was your childhood sport? Like, what did you do growing up? Did you play sport or?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I was a multi-sport athlete. I mean, I'm from Canada, so like we grow up with hockey sticks in our hands. So I played hockey, played baseball, played rugby. And to be honest, I was kind of like the dickhead on the team that never liked working out and doing dryland sports. Like I just liked playing sports. And it was until like I started getting injured, like up into my late teens, early 20s, suffered a bad ACL rupture, and all I could do was go to the gym, and that's kind of where everything started for me in the S&C world because it's all I could do at the time. I was just in the gym, and I just became obsessed with training, periodization, developing strength. Really became a huge focus for me at that time, early in the game. And where I'm from, it's a very small town. You can either do one or two things in the gym. You can bodybuild and get a fake tan, or you can get really strong on the barbell. And there was just like these two groups. So I mean, I went the powerlifting route, but there was also an aesthetic side to me as well too that I like going and getting a little pumped too. But that's really where I found my focus was getting into the powerlifting side of things, and I did that powerlifting competitively for 10 years. Competed on a national level, was trying to get on an international level. and I suffered another injury, which that led me to the mobility and flexibility journey. Because at that point, and I don't know if there's any other listeners here that have experienced this as powerlifters, or just being like in a situation where you're now injured and you realize you don't have any movement options during your injury, and you're like, holy fuck, like I really set myself up for just kind of fucking myself a bit. And this is, I've talked about this a few times because, there's that anti-stretching scene that talks about, fuck stretching or whatever. You don't need to develop these ranges of motions if you don't need them. But when you think of that scenario, two people, for example, one has movement options and has developed strength in multiple ranges and positions where the other hasn't because they haven't needed them. But say they both suffer the same injury. Who's going to be more set up during their recovery process? The person that can move around more, the person that can sit on the floor in a seiza position, can comfortably reach for the floor, can move. So I think that's a scenario that is important to kind of bring to light when you think about injury prevention, because there's always that discussion about like, you can't really prevent injuries and you can't. But if you think about the recovery process of an injury, that's kind of like one of those things you're setting yourself up for, is like giving yourself more options through a recovery period. And I didn't have that when I got injured. I didn't have any of those options. So it was like a big eye opener for me. And when you're kind of faced with those scenarios in life, you either kind of give up, which I almost did, or you look where you
Mm-hmm.
haven't looked. And at the end of the day, I was like, I've never actually dove into developing flexibility. And you start just like thinking to yourself, like, how do you do that? Even like, how does a kid develop flexibility like that? Or how does like an adult develop flexibility like that? And then that's just a rabbit hole. And all of a sudden you start actually exploring those things rather than ignoring them. And you realize there's like a whole process and a whole world of training and developing flexibility that you can relate to your own experiences and develop your own pathways for.
Mm-hmm. Mate, that's awesome. So to go from powerlifting, I feel like I can relate to this. Me being injured myself and both being coaches, we're always searching for solutions to find ways to do things better,
Hmm.
and to always look and like, well, this happened. How we love training so much; it means a lot to us, and it is easy to. Well, it's not easy, but a lot of people would give up and just go, oh, "Fuck this!" Like, I'm broken. I can't do this. I'm just gonna sit on the couch and forget about it. Right? When you start focusing on what you can do, not what you can't, and you start channeling your energy towards finding solutions, you grow as a coach, and then you can
Hmm.
start to obviously look where it's taken you now. It's taken you from an injury to now being, the pinnacle of mobility training in the fitness industry across pretty much the world now. So um, it is, in a way, it's kind of like a blessing in disguise where,
Yep.
I can relate to it rupturing my Achilles, and it's brought me towards mobility. And exactly like you said, the more you can access range, so the more positions you can achieve, there's more than one way of getting one task done, in
Yep.
my opinion.
Yep.
So we look at that people that are quite flexible and strong at end ranges, and then when you put them or you show them a new task or a new movement, for example, in a grappling scenario, where the body is exposed to vulnerable positions, they're the ones that can adapt the fastest. They can do it, from multiple different positions, and they learn the skill faster than other people. And
Yep.
it's just the way the cookie crumbles. And I think the way this is all going now, people just want to move better and feel better. We live in a sedentary world where the majority of people are sitting down for long periods of time, and they're like, "Fuck, I'm going to go sign up to jiu-jitsu, and I'm going to jump in a class." And then they start to realize that, shit, I can't move well. I'm starting to get niggles. I'm starting to get injuries,
Yep.
and then they start to look for solutions where it takes them down a deep dark rabbit hole. And
Yeah, definitely. I think
so
too, I think too, with what you just said, it's like people want to move better and feel better, but they also want to be punched in the face, because I mean, you think about society now, and we've kind of created this like way of living where it's a concrete jungle. We're all on our phones. We've forgotten how to be human, and we need to learn how to live a bit harder. And when we lose that physical culture side to us, which is very, it's, you know, it's about grappling. It's about like, that's why people are so hooked on BJJ. That's like, wrestling was, you know, it's almost like a lost art form. Like back in the day, like when I talk a lot about the old school athletes that they used to lift all rounded, they would do gymnastics, and they would wrestle at championship levels. Like they did it all. And we've forgotten how to do that shit, and it's addicting because as human nature, like we thrive in those environments. We want to get in there, we want to get punched in the face, we want to feel like what it feels like to just get a little bit of a sting. And then we're exposed to that realization, like, fuck, I don't have any capacity to actually put myself in these vulnerable situations, not even positions, but just a situation, right, where you're just like just learning how to be human again. And I think that's what we're finding ourselves in nowadays too, is coming out of that back end. I mean, obviously, we're still you know, technology and all this shit's still going through the roof, but we're still finding a way to embrace all of those things that we've kind of forgotten in a way. And that's where it comes back around to, you know, movement side of things. Like, okay, what do I need more of that will make me a stronger, capable human? So yeah, it is, you know, look good, feel good, but we've almost like taken that feel good thing to a level where people, they do need to get punched in the face a little bit too, because that kind of lets you know, like, okay, this is what it feels like to, you know, be human.
Mm.
And, you know, we don't want to soften it too much either. And I think that's why people like that mobility, flexibility approach to range of strength is like, you know, we're putting ourselves through a different process of strength training that is difficult, but you know, we're learning how to be in these vulnerable type positions and get stronger.
100%. Look, before range of strength, right? Before range of strength came along, what was your training predominantly like other than just powerlifting? Was it, I know you transitioned from hockey, you ruptured your ACL. Was it playing hockey
No, I was playing
when
rugby.
you
Yeah.
rugby? Okay. And what was your recovery protocol like? Did you have surgery? Did you go under the knife? And then,
So this would have been early 2000, like 2000, 2001, when I ruptured the ACL. And I guess we weren't as knife happy at that time. Like the orthopedic surgeon I was working with, he felt like I could get pretty far strength training, and he kind of left surgery up to me, which is kind of weird in a way because everyone has surgery right away when they rupture their knee now, but I ended up not having surgery. Um, so that's, you know, that's been a process as well too. And even powerlifting through those years without an ACL, uh, you know, it's a learning curve. And at the end of the day, like I had to figure out how to move and work my body in ways that maybe most people won't, turn to a lot of different protocols and kind of situations to work through that. One of them was the Feldenkrais method. So I don't know if you're familiar with that method, but he developed that method through years ago before there was surgical interventions for things like ACL sprains and knee injuries. And he developed this practice of movement. So instead of someone getting rid to a wheelchair, he would, you know, put someone through these movement protocols where they would like just learn how to move. Like none of these things were in place at the time. And this developed into like a whole movement system. But I got really hard into that through many of the years of rehabbing the ACL. And that's been like just a part of my practice of like, they call it, what's it called? Like floor ironing, like where you're on the floor surface, kind of like locomotion type stuff. And you're just kind of
yeah,
working through these patterns of movement and lines of tension as well too. Um,
yeah,
so I mean, that led me to powerlifting anyway without an ACL. Like I've been doing a lot of fucked up shit without an ACL. You know, developing splits was a whole journey to go through without that, and just to where I'm at now. Um, so yeah, like training when I switched from powerlifting to going through that mobility journey, it was a little more focused on body weight training, and that was actually what pushed me even harder towards developing better ranges, was getting into some gymnastics work. And the realization there was that I wouldn't even be able to do half of that shit unless I had good flexibility. So that just kind of led me to, like, I had to go through this whole process, this body transformation. And a lot of those things are still in my training now. And this is the thought process I talk a lot about with people I work with, and just other coaches, is talking about relating anything new that you end up doing or other journeys that you go through to your previous experiences. So, like,
Mm.
people will go through some of the training and realize there's components of powerlifting in there. And it's like, like, I thought I was doing flexibility training. And it's like, no, I mean, this is all important stuff, but it just comes from my previous experiences and comes into play with whatever you learn along the way. And that's probably a better mindset to adopt too, instead of saying, like, fuck this, I'm going to quit or whatever. When you're feeling that way, think about moving on, but never giving up on those previous experiences, because they're going to come back in a new way, shape, or form when you learn something new.
That's 100% right, mate. That's a great way to think about it. Like, I can totally relate to what you're saying as well. Like, as a coach, you're always constantly evolving, and you take bits and pieces out of different parts of your life, of skills that you've learned, and you kind of formulate your own system and style. And you've got a perfect blend now with mobility, strength training, and it's great to see. Obviously, where you're doing a lot of this strongman stuff now that I'm seeing, that's quite crazy, where you're challenging some crazy ranges under load. And I mean, if you look at like the base of majority of combat sports, it's all extreme positions in some manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, implementing bits and pieces of this stuff is only going to benefit people that are down that combat sport route, and obviously people that, like you said, are looking for like almost another challenge as well. Like, instead of just rocking up to the gym, and going through your basic strength program, being able to expose your body to more variations, to different stress, you're just going
Yeah.
to become more robust. And
Yeah.
I think that makes training a lot more enjoyable. And, it gives people, you know, more than just one goal of just getting strong. They want to be able to bend, move,
Yeah.
and things like that. And I think that is a great way to keep people interested. And not only that, but also search for more in their training. So,
Yeah.
you know, just getting under a barbell every day, there's more to it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
adding in a little bit of gymnastics here and there, adding in some passive stretching at the end. And this is another thing where that's got me into the next question is, I get asked this question a lot, actually. What are your thoughts on passive stretching? Right? When would you
Yeah.
implement passive stretching into one's training? And the mobility work that you're doing, is the end goal to improve passive range? So there's a lot of questions there. We'll start with the first one.
Yeah.
Uh, if you were, for example, my experience after working with you, I found that passive stretching towards the back end of the
Mm-hmm.
mobility work in your training to promote kind of relaxation and to see where you're at as a tester was when I would prescribe passive stretching.
Yeah.
From a movement prep perspective, I would look at probably contracting, isometrics, just to get the body moving well. And a lot of people would, listening to this, would probably disagree and think, movement prep is a bit of waste of time. But for someone who's stiff like me, I found that I could squat way better by implementing some, you know, end of range kind of strength movements before I got into my strength session.
Yeah.
So what are your takes on passive stretching, and where would you actually see that take place in a program?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple ways to think about this, and I've always tried to think in a way that everyone can relate to. And when it comes to passive stretching, we need to realize that it's the flashlight to the dark cave that your body has never been in before. So when we talk about these end ranges of motion and putting our body through a deeper range of motion, we need to learn how to do that passively. And that's our flashlight, because now our body and our brain can evaluate the position, can make sense of it, can know that it's safe to be there. And then we can do some work. And a passive stretching protocol is not going to be just passive in nature the whole time. So it's kind of, when we talk about static passive, work, there's a lot of active components to it. And we'll come back around to that. But the other realization there is that most people just can't stretch because they're so tight or they're so immobile, and we need to do some work to actually stretch because you have poor stretch conditioning. And that's kind of what I've called it, is like it's stretch conditioning. Like you actually aren't conditioned to stretch yet. So that's where I think that's an experience that or a tool you gain for me, is like we're doing some work to then stretch. Some of the work that we do before that may involve some loaded stretching protocols, some well thought of end range positions to get into, complementary stretches to a loaded stretch exercise, interset stretching type approach, to then actually get into a passive stretch. So now we've and most people I think feel this way anyway if they've gone through a good strength session. Like you can develop a good strength session for the most part through full range of motion. And once someone has done most of the workout through full ROM, and when it's properly prescribed to them, they then feel like they can stretch. But there has to be
Mm.
context to the stretch. You can't just tell someone, go stretch your upper body. It's like, what muscles are we stretching? What's the technique? How long do we hold? And there are active components to it once we've relaxed. And those active components are a form of strength training. And that was another post I shared recently where it's this whole stretching is useless talk. It's like, if you thought about stretching differently as an intervention of strength for someone who can't find a way to strengthen this end range of motion or this vulnerable position, that's how I view it. And that's when it made the most sense to me, was when I thought, holy shit, this is actually just isometrics in a vulnerable position. And it's like, I'm
Yeah.
producing strength, I'm building strength and tolerance here. This isn't what I thought it was, which is obviously the passive bullshit, which it still has its time and place. If we're thinking about training the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, like there's all of these components, and like stretching, there's so many options to it, and it's not taught well, it's not taken seriously enough in a lot of different contexts for people to actually make sense of it. So there's just so much nuance to it. Like you just hear so many different definitions of it, or so many different, but you really just have to find a coach or someone that's gone through it and can teach it well and teach it to you, and it will make sense. Like it's all strength.
Definitely. Look, one question that's been playing on my mind, and how do you determine the difference between pain and discomfort in a stretch? Like for myself, I will push things from
Mm-hmm.
personal experience, and as you probably know, working with me, I like to generally overdo things a little bit, and I found that it can have a negative effect on range when I found like I've either gone too hard too soon, couldn't really relax into the stretch and breathe into the new range, and felt like, obviously having a high pain threshold, I couldn't tell the difference between discomfort and pain because I'd been tight for a majority of my life. So I think there's a lot of people out there who I've spoken to personally that have delved into some mobility training and not really understand the context around how to actually determine the difference between pain and discomfort, and
Mm.
how to ease your way into mobility training. And that's something that I think a lot of listeners out there would like to know, me personally as well. So that's something like, if you're an individual who's like, fuck, I've got to get flexible. Let's push it. Let's go hard. Sometimes it can have a reverse effect if you go too hard too
Yeah,
soon.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the best results, even in the literature, that have shown improvements in flexibility and even hypertrophy response, come when we induce some pain thresholds in a stretch. But how does that look and how does that prescribed, right? And so, like, if you hear that, I mean, people are going to just get into a stretch and push themselves right away. And we need to understand mechanical tension versus neural tension. And the neural tension response is what we're trying to override in a stretch. So if we are limited to a certain range of motion that isn't our full range of motion, say, for example, in the hamstring. So when I go to get into a hamstring stretch and I feel it bite right away, uh, it's going to feel more neurological. So the body's like just giving us a hard stop. And this is also where we would want to be thinking about starting a stretch. So it's important for people to understand these differences, because if we're able to understand that and spend time in that position, we can learn to override this stretch reflex response. And this takes time, right? So when we say things like, or I've said things like, you probably never stretched before if you haven't held a stretch for more than 2 minutes. This is for those people that have these hard stop feelings when they stretch and they try to stretch through it. We need to learn how to stretch better. So there's a process of like holding these positions that don't feel like they're pain inducing, but we also need to allow a stretch sensation to accumulate. So that's often what I'll teach with students is like getting into a stretch and actually just not moving for a little bit to feel it accumulate. And it's the same as like warming up with a barbell. You're not going to go right to your max. We have to be in a position and be patient, and once we start feeling this stretch sensation accumulate, we can start doing some work to relax deeper into a stretch. So this is like when it comes to that, like getting to pain in a stretch, like those are things that we need to understand. Um, Once we've spent time understanding that, we can then learn the difference between discomfort and pain. A lot of times, if someone isn't stretching, they're going to feel discomfort. Discomfort's going to feel like pain. We do need to be able to create some kind of language for them to understand. And I've used the RPE chart, actually, similar to how it's used for lifting, to identify what it feels like in a stretch for that person. So if you can identify a scale for someone where maybe a 7 is indicating that it feels uncomfortable, but you can hold it, or you're approaching a threshold, like these are important variables and things for someone to learn with their own body, because not only will we be able to like allow them to not push too hard right away, we can then start pushing them harder in a stretch. So once they start actually like, and this is why people feel so uncomfortable in a stretch, because none of it makes sense to them. So we're now making it make sense. This should feel like a 7. This should feel like you can hold it, but you're uncomfortable. Okay, that makes sense. So this is what it feels like here. Okay, we're going to hold that for a period of time, and then we're going to look to move to an 8 out of 10, which means like you can hold it for maybe 30 more seconds. So you're actually teaching someone how hard they want to push themselves into a stretch. And this can be periodized in a lot of different ways. So even teaching someone to be at a 7 or 8 out of 10, for example, for 3 weeks without making change, that's important, because then they can develop good habits and consistency and actually just show up. Then we can start pushing them and actually have them moving towards thresholds of a stretch where they then start to make a lot of progress. And very similar, when you've done that, when you push yourself over time in a stretching or flexibility program, your body's going to kind of need this period of recovery before it gets back into ranges of motion. So it's this whole teaching learning process, just like we go through when we try to get strong. And I always talk about the first time I went to the gym and put a barbell on my neck. It was the most excruciating feeling in my life. I was like, why the hell am I doing this? This is terrible. And then, there's someone there who's been through it, and they're like, no, that's normal. It'll get better if you keep doing it. And you're like, okay. If no one was there, I probably would have never did it again, because it felt like shit. My neck was sore for a week, but you keep going and your body adapts. You get over it and you get better at understanding the process. And this is what people need to want to go through that process if they want to improve their range of motion, which is why it's important to also not just like be dogmatic about it and say like you have to do this. It's like you got to want to do it, or you're just not going to
Exactly.
succeed. It's just like anything, just like it's just like anything.
You're preaching to the choir, man. I feel your
Yeah.
pain. I totally get that. And it's like, I think, you got to want it. at the end of the day, you've got to want to make change. It's not just magically going to fall on your lap. And I think you preach it well. And I think mobility training it's strength training, right?
Hmm.
If it's done correctly,
No,
and
absolutely.
the body needs to, yeah. So if the application's right, the adaptation will take place, and over time, the adaptation will start to increase. The range will start to increase over time, and it's just like anything. We got to be patient, and
Hmm.
you know, guys want to see results the next day, and it's not the case. You might even feel tighter the next day because you're sore from
Yep.
loading positions at end ranges, and that's just normal.
Yep.
So, one last thing. This is the last question. How do you manage? This is kind of like for the older guys out there with small families who can relate to this. How do you find the time to run a business, be a dad of 3 kids, find time to train, and do it all? So, what would your schedule be like? And I kind of know off the top
Yeah.
of my head, discipline is the key thing here.
No, it is for sure. And it's hard. Like at the end of the day, it is hard. And then you got to accept it's hard. You got to plan for moments where you're going to step back and plan for moments like where you can tell yourself, okay, I've done enough for today. But I mean, getting to a certain level that I'm at right now, there were some grinding periods there where I was a lot of late nights, going through messages, running things on my own, right? And like I'm at a point now where there's some people helping out with certain administrative type things that I was doing on my own at the start, and you know, finding ways to buy your time back at some point is important. And I think it's important to like get to a point where buying your time back is sometimes more important than making more money, right? And sometimes we can get in this like headspace where it's like
Yeah,
very money driven and like uh, that kind of outcome focus. And that's not really why I think we're doing this. We're doing this because we love this, right? We're doing this because um, we want to be able to keep doing this. And that's been a big realization for me in the last couple of years is like, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid. And there's a lot of people that are willing to help. Um, and good help isn't that hard to find if you get yourself into a good inner circle of people. Um, but my day at this point, it's messages in the morning and messages in the evening, and that's like a non-negotiable. So we you got to have those non-negotiables that you know you're doing um, every single day, regardless of what's happening. I mean, there's planned days off for certain reasons, but as long as that's a message that's communicated, and training is non-negotiable. So as like those non-negotiables for me, they help me develop time for other projects because it's like you need some consistency, some habits that are going to happen on a regular basis, some routine. So developing your routine and actually making sure that that's something that you're putting forward. It's keeping you consistent with your diet, consistent with your sleep schedule. Like those are the things that keep me consistent with those parts of my life is like having the non-negotiables in place. Like these are things that I'm doing. Nothing's going to stop me from doing these things. And I have to obviously have these certain habits in place to make sure those get done. Um, Time for innovation and creativeness. Like I think that's a space that oftentimes, like you probably feel this too, like content creation and those sort of things.
mm,
Like we don't want to find ourselves in a space where we're forcing that all the time. So there should be some planned time throughout the week where you're finding time to like just keep yourself in a space of thought and just like allowing things to come to mind, like brainstorming, thinking of ideas, thinking of some kind of project. The podcast, like this, is this your first podcast episode?
this is my first one. You're my first guest.
Yeah. So I mean, this was obviously an idea that's been brewing in your mind, and you've had some times where you've thought about it, like completely separate of work and your non-negotiables. And that's kind of hard to do, right? Because those thoughts are always there, but we need to action those. Because like
That's
for
right.
example, I just started doing the workshops last year in November, and that's been on my mind for a year. And it was just time for me to just action that. Like just do it. Like what are you sitting on this for? Like
Mm,
so there are
exactly.
those ideas. I we're sitting on all those ideas, right? Like, am I going to start posting every day? Just start doing it. Just like start doing it and take notes about how it's going and learn from the process. Um, but for me, it's always the non-negotiables, like having a list of things that I am going to do on a regular basis in place. And when those things are in place, it makes it easier for me to have time to think about the projects, kind of innovative approach to content creation, what those strategies look like. Um, and I think that's where a lot of times in the past, when I've worked with coaches or guys running a business and all that things, like the non-negotiable, like habits and daily routines are just not in place. And they're hard to do, but we also try to put too many things on our plate at one time to make that happen. Um, but I would say that's kind of like the thing that keeps me going. And when those things are out of sync, everything gets out of sync for me, like my relationships, all of those things, right? So
Yeah,
it's like very
dude,
important that there's some kind of daily routine and habit in place.
definitely. I totally understand where you're coming from with that. And, you know, like I set myself a goal. I was like, all right, I wasn't big on social media a year ago. Like I wasn't a big fan of posting content, frequently. I was, running 35, 40 PT sessions a week in front of clients. And I was burnt by the end of the week. And the last thing I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to do was tell everyone about my business and who I'm training. So it got to a stage where COVID happened and the transition, where I phased out of a big commercial facility and opened up my own facility and started to delve into working with combat athletes. And I set myself a goal. I was like, you know what? Fuck what people think of you. Just put yourself out there. You've
Yep.
got, you're going to add value to people's lives. You're going to help people out there. And I just set myself a goal. I was like, right, I'm going to post 6 times a week. I'm going to do 3 reels, a couple of carousels, and that's it,
Yep.
right? And it does get to a stage where you feel like you're force feeding it, and you're like, okay, well, I need to post today. I'm at a stage now where it's just a part of your life. It's like I don't even think about it. I just go in. I go, all right, I'm going to work on some hip mobility drills, and I'm just going to, film some content on that and post it, right? It's going to help some sort of combat athlete out there. And
Yep.
that's basically what I did for the last, year, and it's starting to pay off. So you've got your workshops going now. You've got the Range of Strength network, and you've got also your online training program where you have like a subscription model where guys can work with you on enhancing their flexibility, and it's a base protocol. That's what you've got, right?
Yeah. And I mean, just adding to like what you're saying too, with regards to like taking action and stuff, like sometimes people like to think that all that stuff happens overnight too, right? It's like I've been doing this for how many years now? 20 years coaching. And even my early powerlifting years, I remember I had this like strength blog because remember the blogging was like the big thing. And
Yeah, back in the day.
I have this old powerlifting YouTube channel that's still, I think, around. But like we've been doing it, like it's been a hard 10 years go at like even just developing what range of strength is and posting every day and failing and just learning from that. And just like when it fails, it's like, okay, what do I have to do to get better? How can I get better? Like what are like, like what are the next steps? And it's still not in a space where I'm like happy with it. I'm still learning like the content creation stuff. I'm like going hard with this year. It's like, but I mean, recently, just to be between you and me, or I mean the listeners obviously, but uh, a lot of people in my hometown have always known that I'm a trainer, but they don't know nothing about range of strength and nothing about any of the things I'm doing online really. And then it was only recently where people around the world start to care, and I'm doing these workshops and people are like, what are you going there for? I'm like, I'm teaching. It's like I'm teaching the stuff I've been doing. They're like, oh, okay, well, what is it you're
Yeah.
doing? Right? Like people don't really kind of give a shit sometimes
No,
until you find your people, right? So that can be
dude.
frustrating too. You get stuck in those I guess no one gives a shit kind of thing, but there's people out there that want to do the things you're doing, and they'll find you, and that's what's so great about the social media platforms.
That's totally agree. And like anyone that's listening, like I mean, look, I'm still early into my journey on the online process. I've been a coach for over 15 years, and, getting familiar with transitioning to an online space, it's quite daunting at the start, and you feel like giving up, and you feel like, fuck, man, this is just a grind. There's meaningless growth. I don't see the growth versus the effort that I'm putting in. And I was listening to one of David Gray's podcasts, and one thing he said, it's like, before you even think about selling a program, post content for 2 years. Just 2 years, post every single day until you start adding value to people's lives, and then you may be able to sell a program.
Yeah.
So it was a big eye opener. And I think that, content is just your way of communicating to your audience, and,
Yep.
being able to reach more people worldwide, which is great. So we're going to wrap it up. And I just want to, last thing, if you were to give one tip to anyone that's listening to this that wants to enhance their mobility, just one tip, what would be the golden tip that you would give someone out there who's venturing out into a mobility journey, looking to enhance flexibility and range of motion? What is one golden tip you would give them?
You need to understand that stretching is a skill. And if you haven't dived into that skill enough to fully understand it, like a lot of these things I've said, like if you haven't held a stretch for 2 minutes, you've never stretched. If you haven't spent time understanding the strength applications that occur within a stretch, and this is for someone who wants to improve their flexibility and that they haven't yet, like that is the golden ticket. You have to actually dive into stretching and take it seriously and understand that it's its own practice and its own skill. And you'll, again, be able to come back, relate it to your previous experiences, and it'll just be the golden ticket to everything else that you have. Because everything else that everyone has is like anyone can kind of access that stuff and do that stuff. And it's the ones that can't find the breakthroughs they're looking for with their flexibility or find ways to train in these ranges of motions that are vulnerable or positions that they feel they will never be able to get again. And I've been there, and I've actually been in that position, and that was the ticket for me, was like figuring out I've never actually fucking stretched before.
That's awesome. That's a great point, man. Thank you for that. Look, I feel like I could speak to you for fucking hours on this, but I know you got to go. We got to wrap things up. So where can we find you?
Instagram's the biggest social media space right now for me. And I've been trying to get branched out into either YouTube, like the YouTube stuff. It's the long form work. Like if you are interested in like some of the deeper dive uh, things that I've done, that's a good place to check out. But branching out into the other platforms like TikTok and Twitter and all those things, that's like a goal of mine. But Instagram is the main platform to find most of my stuff.
Awesome. You got some guys, you should check out his content. Lucas here has some fantastic content on mobility. Mate, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, great to connect, brother.